The Neva River, dark and unforgiving, mirrored the bruised purple of the late autumn sky above St. Petersburg. The air hung heavy and sharp, smelling of wet stone and industrial brine. It was the kind of cold that seized the lungs and promised no relief, burrowing deep into the bone regardless of layers. Near the palace bridge, police lights strobed weakly against the persistent fog, painting the cobblestones in desperate pulses of blue and red. A small crowd of early morning commuters stood clustered, held back by thin yellow tape, their breath visible as plumes of nervous steam. Senior Lieutenant Yulia Petrova stood at the riverbank, her gaze fixed not on the frigid water, but on the man shivering violently under the thermal blanket provided by the emergency services. He was Professor Dmitry Volkov, a historian of international renown, a recognized authority on the Napoleonic era, decorated by multiple European governments. He was a pillar of academic respectability, currently dripping cold river water onto the immaculate floor of an official vehicle. He claimed a sudden slip, a momentary loss of balance during a solitary late-night walk, compounded by a few too many glasses of vintage Georgian wine. His story was mundane, expected, and designed to elicit swift dismissal and quiet transport home. The other officers on the scene, recognizing his face and status from local media and televised lectures, already deferred to him, offering hushed apologies for the inconvenience. They saw a great man having a terrible, embarrassing accident. Yulia saw something different. Her training, honed by years spent wading through bureaucratic indifference, demanded strict adherence to the protocol of disturbance calls, regardless of the individual's pedigree. She observed the set of his jaw, the strange, proprietary tension in his shoulders despite the visible hypothermia. His polished academic demeanor, usually grand and expansive, was compressed into a tight mask of forced shock. The object that had initially drawn the attention of the patrol boat was a large, military-style backpack, weighted heavily and almost submerged when the professor was pulled from the churning current. Volkov had clung to it with disturbing tenacity, claiming it contained vital, irreplaceable research note. Yulia requested the bag be secured and inventoried before being returned. An older sergeant scoffed softly, suggesting the professor's word was sufficient, that they should avoid further discomfort to such an important figure. Yulia ignored the implicit reprimand. She stepped closer, her eyes tracing the fine weave of Volkov's saturated overcoat. The river water had stained everything uniformly dark, but near the cuff of his right sleeve, protected slightly by the angle of his wrist, was a stark contrast, a tiny, distinct spatter of dark, oxidized crimson. It was not the flat, earthy brown of river mud or decayed leaf. It was arterial blood. The weight of the bag, now resting on a plastic tarp near her boots, felt unnatural under the pressure of her gloved hand. It shifted with a fleshy, uneven resistance. Yulia knelt, the cold radiating up through the concrete. She ordered the bag opened, the request formal and absolute. When the zipper finally yielded, revealing the meticulously wrapped bundles concealed beneath layers of plastic sheeting, the stench that erupted was not that of river decay, but something far worse. The metallic, cloying odor of a recent slaughter, mingled sharply with the chemical burn of industrial cleaning agents. The world outside the police cordon seemed to dim as the reality of the contents revealed itself. Professor Volkov, the historian of empire, was instantly transformed from a victim of circumstance into a suspect of unthinkable atrocity. Yulia's procedural skepticism had just unearthed the gruesome secret clinging to the edge of the Neva, pulling a dark curtain back on a crime that transcended mere violence, striking at the heart of institutional respectability. The hunt for the full scope of the tragedy began instantly, driven by the cold certainty of a junior officer's unwavering attention to a single, crimson stain. The forensic team arrived shortly thereafter, moving with the practiced efficiency that only deep, ingrained horror could produce. The professor, now stripped of his borrowed respectability and held under strict watch, was isolated. The initial scene expanded rapidly from a cold riverbank disturbance to a full-scale murder investigation. The victim was quickly identified, based on the preliminary examination of the remains, as Anastasia Petrova, a brilliant young student and the professor's research assistant. The physical evidence pointed immediately toward the professor's opulent, historic apartment near the Fontanka Canal, a residence filled with artifacts and a library spanning centuries. Detectives, led by Chief Investigator Major Kirill Resnik, were mobilized, their initial reluctance at questioning such a prominent figure quickly dissolving under the grim weight of the forensic findings. The immediate search warrant was secured not due to overwhelming proof of guilt, but due to Yulia's precise and immediate documentation of the physical evidence. The blood, the specific wrapping material, and the highly unusual implement marks detected on the remains before they were fully contaminated by the river water. The air in the investigation room was thick with professional tension. Volkov maintained a chilling composure, speaking in the measured, academic tones of a man delivering a lecture, asserting his innocence, demanding his solicitor, and referencing his extensive network of powerful contacts. His calmness was unsettling, contradicting the desperation of his attempt to dispose of the evidence in the dark river. Resnik, a veteran detective accustomed to the lies of the street, found the professor's intellectual arrogance particularly galling. It was a defense mechanism built on the presumed invincibility of status. The team at the forensic lab worked in silence, driven by the urgency of the initial findings. The specific method of dismemberment suggested a deliberate, almost surgical precision, inconsistent with a crime of passion, yet the sheer brutality spoke of intense rage. They needed to find the crime scene, secure the remaining body parts, and establish a clear timeline for the act, which Yulia's observations suggested had occurred recently, perhaps within the last 24 hours. Every clock, every calendar entry, and every recorded phone call belonging to the professor became a critical element in the emerging narrative of obsession and betrayal. The apartment proved to be a grotesque stage set. Napoleonic-era uniforms hung stiffly on mannequins, swords and pistols displayed openly, and the heavy, historically accurate furniture was draped with tarpaulins. Beneath the academic reverence lay the residue of violence. Luminol revealed extensive efforts at cleaning, yet the spatter patterns on the lower half of a large oil portrait proved unmistakable. The scale of the cleanup effort suggested premeditation, a calculated attempt to erase the young woman's presence from his highly controlled, historical world. As the forensic sweep continued, they discovered a hidden room, accessible only through a cleverly concealed bookcase. This chamber was not a library annex but a shrine, photographs of Anastasia arranged in obsessive, chronological order, mixed with notes detailing her academic schedule, personal habits, and private communications. The historian had not just taught his student. He had meticulously catalogued and controlled her life. The macabre theater confirmed Yulia's initial instinct. This was not a drunk academic who stumbled into tragedy, but a highly organized predator who had mistaken his prestige for immunity. The pressure mounted instantly. The media, alerted by the unusual police activity near the historic center, began to swarm. The university issued a statement of profound shock and promised full cooperation, but the inherent conflict was clear. A respected institution was harboring a monster. Resnik looked at Yulia, recognizing the silent, professional intensity in her eyes. Her procedural rigor had cracked the shield of the elite. The investigation now shifted from finding the culprit to meticulously reconstructing the psychological labyrinth that had culminated in this unspeakable violence, proving the meticulous nature of the crime despite the suspect's high-profile protestations of innocence. The subsequent search of Volkov's teaching office yielded crucial digital evidence, contradicting his carefully constructed alibis. His academic calendar, usually open and public, contained numerous, aggressively blocked entries corresponding to the estimated time of Anastasia's disappearance. Forensic IT specialists managed to retrieve encrypted communications revealing a pattern of escalating verbal abuse and controlling behavior directed toward the young woman in the weeks leading up to the murder. Volkov had systematically attempted to isolate her from her friends and family, subtly leveraging his power as her mentor and lover. Investigators focused on the purchase records for the specific chemicals used in the cleanup, tracing large quantities of industrial-strength bleach and specialized cleaning equipment back to a series of cash transactions made by the professor days before the incident. This established a critical element of premeditation that would dismantle any defense claiming a spontaneous crime of passion. The meticulous planning required for the disposal process further reinforced the chilling calculation behind the act. Major Resnick orchestrated the formal interrogation. Volkov, still wrapped in his superior air, attempted to guide the conversation toward his academic achievements and the invaluable nature of his work. He spoke of Anastasia in proprietary terms, framing her death as a great tragedy, yet failing to exhibit any authentic grief. The detective team, however, withheld the extent of their evidence, allowing the professor to weave his narrative of accidental violence and misjudgment. They waited for his version of events to solidify, knowing that the physical and digital evidence would eventually shatter it completely. The initial autopsy reports delivered a powerful blow against Volkov's narrative. The victim had sustained defensive wounds, indicating a struggle, and the cause of death was confirmed as multiple stab wounds, administered with brutal force. Crucially, the medical examiner provided a detailed profile of the weapon used, a long, thin blade with a specific curvature. Resnick immediately dispatched a unit back to the professor's apartment to cross-reference this profile with the extensive collection of historical weaponry displayed there. Meanwhile, Yulia focused on the periphery, tracing Anastasia's final movements. She interviewed the few classmates the professor had not managed to alienate. They spoke of Anastasia's growing fear, her attempts to quietly sever ties, and Volkov's increasingly desperate and volatile response to her perceived defiance. The professor's obsession was not merely academic, it was existential. His identity seemed inextricably linked to his ability to control his intellectual environment, and Anastasia's withdrawal represented an unacceptable challenge to his perceived sovereignty. The evidence converged rapidly. In the professor's study, tucked away inside a shadow box displaying Napoleonic medals, they found a small, antique dagger. Its blade curvature matched the medical examiner's specifications precisely. It had been thoroughly cleaned, but microscopic analysis revealed faint traces of the victim's DNA trapped in the handle's aged ivory inlay. The historian's elaborate world, built upon layers of prestige and historical narrative, was finally beginning to crumble under the relentless scrutiny of modern forensic procedure. The discovery of the murder weapon provided the leverage Resnick needed for the final, intense confrontation. Brought back for a second, more focused interview, Volkov found his academic defenses failing against the objective reality of the forensic data. When confronted with the visual evidence of the cleaning supply purchases and the recovered dagger, the mask of scholarly detachment finally cracked, replaced by a torrent of rage. Volkov began to confess, but his admissions were filtered through the language of historical justification. He framed the murder not as a crime, but as a tragic, necessary consequence of betrayal. He accused Anastasia of intellectual theft and disloyalty, attempting to elevate his monstrous act into some form of historical retribution against a perceived slight to his professional legacy. This psychological maneuver, meant to manipulate the investigators, only served to highlight the depth of his narcissistic pathology. The complete reconstruction of the crime scene and timeline was finalized. The murder had occurred in the apartment, a premeditated act carried out with shocking calm. The subsequent attempt at disposal in the Nevo was a desperate, panicked maneuver only undertaken when he realized the scale of the physical evidence remaining. The sheer arrogance of the act, believing his status would blind the authorities, was astonishing. The lead detective assigned to the case, Detective Ivan Maximov, felt a profound weight lift with the confession, yet the complexity of the motive remained disturbing. This was not a random act of violence. It was the ultimate expression of control by a man accustomed to absolute authority, who reacted to rejection with obliteration. The investigation transcended simple homicide. It became an examination of how unchecked power could warp morality and silence dissent. The political fallout was immediate and intense. The university faced a storm of public condemnation. Questions arose about the institutional blindness that had allowed Volkov's known history of manipulation and volatile behavior towards students to be consistently ignored for years. The case exposed the deep vulnerability of young women operating within established power structures, where the word of a renowned professor often outweighed the concerns of a student. Yulia, now standing by the riverbank a week later as the last pieces of evidence were collected, felt a quiet satisfaction. The city still felt cold, but the urgency had subsided. She had adhered strictly to protocol, focusing only on the facts presented by the scene, not the reputation of the man involved. That professional discipline had prevented the disappearance of both a victim and the truth. The trial, highly publicized and intensely scrutinized, moved swiftly given the overwhelming physical evidence and Volkov's detailed confession. The defense attempted to mitigate the severity of the act by referencing the professor's mental state and his devotion to his historical obsession, but the evidence of premeditation, the cleaning supplies, the isolation, the controlled nature of the violence, was insurmountable. Volkov was ultimately convicted and sentenced to a lengthy term in a high-security penal colony. The case provided a stark, unsettling reflection on the nature of justice, demonstrating that sometimes the most grotesque evil hides beneath the most prestigious facade. It also underscored the necessity of institutional skepticism, the need to treat every crime scene with the same methodical rigor, regardless of the suspect's social standing. Major Resnick personally commended Yulia for her acute observation and unwavering commitment to procedure in the face of institutional pressure. Her action at the riverbank was credited as the pivot point that secured the case before critical evidence could be lost. Years later, the memory of the case lingered like the permanent chill of the Neva. Yulia continued her work, promoted and respected, but the experience had fundamentally altered her perception of the human condition. She understood that monuments of knowledge and achievement could be built upon foundations of profound moral decay. Justice, she recognized, was rarely a grand, sweeping act, but rather the result of countless, meticulous details patiently observed and rigorously documented. The city moved on, covering the horror with its usual layers of fog and routine, but Yulia carried the silent certainty that true power lay not in status, but in the unflinching dedication to truth, no matter how ugly or uncomfortable it proved to be. She stood briefly on the palace bridge one evening, looking down at the dark, unforgiving flow of the Neva, a silent witness to both history and its terrible violations. The formal investigation now spiraled outward, moving from the crime scene reconstruction and the confession's confirmation to the systemic failures that had allowed the professor's volatility to fester. The focus shifted to the university's internal mechanism for handling student complaints and interpersonal dispute. It became clear that Anastasia had not been the first young woman to suffer under Volkov's intense, controlling mentorship, yet all previous grievances had been quietly absorbed, neutralized by the academic administration's priority of reputation over individual welfare. Further scrutiny revealed a hidden archive of internal memos detailing multiple instances where former students had raised concerns about the professor's inappropriate demands and sudden, frightening bursts of anger. These documents, buried deep within departmental servers, showed a consistent pattern of faculty complicity. Concerns were invariably classified as misunderstandings or unfortunate byproducts of academic rigor, ensuring that Volkov's prestigious research funding and international standing remained undisturbed. The institution acted as an elaborate echo chamber, reflecting the professor's own inflated self-worth and effectively silencing any dissenting voices that threatened the hierarchy. Consequently, Detective Maximov began coordinating interviews with former students who had left the program abruptly years prior. Their testimonies painted a consistent picture of psychological manipulation that preceded the physical violence uncovered in the present case. They spoke of intellectual intimidation, emotional blackmail, and the suffocating pressure of being drawn into the professor's complex, self-aggrandizing world. One particularly crucial interview was with Dr. Elena Sorokina, now a successful scholar in Paris, who detailed how Volkov had systematically undermined her work and career trajectory after she rejected his advances, labeling her academically inferior until she was forced to transfer universities. Building upon this, however, the investigative team recognized that the case transcended the personal pathology of one man. It exposed a pervasive culture of impunity afforded to powerful figures. The concept of academic freedom had been cynically warped into a shield protecting exploitation. The legal team handling the prosecution began exploring precedents for charging institutional negligence alongside the homicide, arguing that the university's deliberate inaction had created the environment in which the fatal obsession could flourish unchecked. Another crucial layer emerged through the analysis of Volkov's financial record. While his salary was substantial, large, irregular payments were discovered flowing from a private trust established by one of the university's principal benefactors, a local industrialist deeply invested in maintaining the university's prestige. This discovery hinted at possible external pressure exerted on the administration to overlook the professor's behavioral eccentricities, suggesting corruption far beyond mere departmental politicking. The industrialist viewed Volkov's international lectures and publications as vital marketing tools, and the cost of protecting that image, apparently, included overlooking the safety of students. This systemic element demanded a profound shift in the investigative strategy. It was no longer simply about securing a conviction for murder, it was about tearing down the protective scaffolding surrounding the wealthy and influential. Yulia, now working closely with the Internal Affairs Unit, found herself confronting police colleagues who had previously been recipients of the industrialist's donations to departmental charities. The subtle resistance she encountered, the slow processing of requests, the deliberate misfiling of documents, was far more insidious than the overt rage of the professor. It was the quiet resistance of an entrenched system defending its comfort and complacency. The original horror of the crime now seemed to ripple outwards, exposing the structural rot beneath the city's celebrated academic and social surface. The integrity of the entire judicial and academic system was now on trial, interwoven with the fate of one dead student. The investigation, once a sharply focused lens on an individual act of savagery, had metastasized into an examination of the intricate structures that enabled it. It was like peeling back layers of polished lacquer to reveal the wood beneath, the grain warped, riddled with unseen infestation. The professional diligence demonstrated by Yulia at the water's edge had not simply captured a murderer, it had triggered a chain reaction, exposing the institutional mechanisms designed less for truth and more for the quiet preservation of hierarchy. The initial confrontation with the professor was merely the beginning of a far more complex engagement, one that pitted procedural integrity against systemic inertia. Reflecting on this journey so far, one understood that the pursuit of justice was never a clean, straight path. It was a turbulent current, often diverted by unseen reefs of influence and counterpressures. The weight of evidence gathered, the forensic reports meticulously detailing the violence, the digital trails illuminating the obsessive control, was compelling in a court of law. Yet, the real battle lay outside the courtroom, within the corridors of power where reputation functioned as a stronger currency than verifiable fact. Every piece of procedural excellence, every secured warrant and verified alibi contradiction, had to contend with an entrenched culture accustomed to making inconvenient truths simply disappear. The personal costs of this dedication were beginning to accrue. Major Resnick felt the familiar friction of internal affairs scrutinizing budgets and manpower allocations, subtle pressure points applied by those who preferred the comfortable narrative of a singular, isolated lunatic rather than the unsettling implication of widespread complicity. Yulia, though celebrated publicly, experienced the cold shoulder of colleagues whose long-standing departmental allegiances were threatened by the exposure of their institution's quiet failures. The light of truth, while essential, was proving inconveniently bright, illuminating corners that many had preferred to leave dusty and forgotten. The collected strands of evidence, the financial transactions, the suppressed complaints, the testimony of abandoned scholars, formed a complex tapestry of moral ambiguity. It confirmed that the academic monster was not self-made, but carefully cultivated by a network prioritizing prestige and endowment over human safety. The horrifying climax of the student's life was not a sudden rupture, but the culmination of a slow, corrosive process, where warning signals were consistently reclassified as negligible noise. The detective team now recognized that their victory would be incomplete if it only resulted in the incarceration of one man. True resolution demanded the dismantling of the edifice that had shielded him. The moment of final confrontation was rapidly approaching, not just with the convicted killer, but with the broader system that enabled him. The prosecution was preparing to present the synthesis of this cultural breakdown, forcing the court to confront the wider responsibility. The core insight gained was that integrity, when exercised without fear or favor, becomes the most potent weapon against corruption. It was this unflinching commitment, starting with one officer's refusal to accept a high-status man's convenient lie, that promised to pry open the secretive world of elite institutions. The final reckoning required more than judicial sentence. It necessitated a systemic reckoning, a forceful repositioning of morality over market value, drawing the complex narrative toward its inevitable, complex conclusion. The foundation of the great man's world had been exposed as rotten, and the next move would determine whether the rotten supports could drag down everything around them, or whether a painful, necessary cleansing could finally occur. The harsh St. Petersburg winter deepened, mirroring the chill that settled over the city following the professor's conviction. The high-profile trial concluded not with a bang, but with the measured, inevitable slam of the prison door closing on decades of undeserved acclaim. Dmitri Volkov, stripped of his academic armor and historical pretense, was reduced to a mere number, his towering reputation permanently overshadowed by the chilling record of his crime. Yet, for Major Resnick and Lieutenant Petrova, the formal closure brought only a complex, uneasy silence. They had achieved justice for Anastasia, but they understood that the system which had nurtured the killer remained largely intact. The university, though deeply wounded and publicly shamed, began the slow, predictable process of self-healing, issuing internal reviews and superficial policy changes designed to appease public outcry while preserving core structures of power. The documents detailing the years of ignored warnings and administrative negligence, exposed during the trial, served not merely as exhibits of Volkov's pathology but as indictments of a culture that prioritized institutional image over moral responsibility. The true victory, Petrova realized, lay not in the individual's capture, but in the crack they had forced into the rigid facade of the elite establishment, a reminder that prestige should never function as a shield against scrutiny. She often returned, in quiet moments of reflection, to the riverbank, to the precise moment when the academic's calculated lie began to unravel under the weight of a single-minute observation. The cold logic of forensic procedure had proven a formidable antidote to the intoxicating haze of status. It was the unwavering adherence to the mundane, the detailed inventory, the microscopic analysis of a blood spatter, that ultimately demolished the elaborate psychological defense Volkov had constructed from historical arrogance. This was the enduring lesson. Truth is not found in celebrity endorsements or academic titles, but in the disciplined respect for fact. The greatest challenge had not been identifying the perpetrator, but navigating the subtle, pervasive resistance of those accustomed to protecting their own. The investigation forced a confrontation not just with a murderer, but with the quiet tyranny of convenience, the bureaucratic impulse to minimize scandal and avoid painful self-examination. The industrialists' financial threads, the veiled threats from internal oversight, the academic community's collective shrug over prior abuses, these were the dark currents that had nearly dragged the truth under, proving far more slippery and enduring than the professor's theatrical rage. Now, standing on the polished granite of the police headquarters, Petrova accepted the quiet professional regard of her superiors, an acknowledgment of competence that spoke volumes without needing fanfare. Her actions had validated the foundational principle of police work. The objective pursuit of evidence must be absolute, blind to wealth, title, or influence. The case had affirmed that justice, in the face of sophisticated power, often requires not dramatic heroism, but simply the refusal to look away. The city outside continued its relentless pace, building new narratives over the scars of the old. But for those who knew the truth of the Neva's dark secret, the chilling realization remained. Every society holds within it the potential for institutional blindness. The price of complacency is steep, paid for by the vulnerable who challenge the dominant narrative. The responsibility, therefore, rested not just on the detectives, but on every individual to wield a continuous, moral skepticism. The final, essential insight derived from the horror was this: the only way to safeguard integrity against the corrosive effects of unchecked power is through perpetual, disciplined vigilance, ensuring that the cold, hard facts always possess the authority to shatter the warmest lie.